Welcome back, everybody. Another edition here of the Auburn Undercover Podcast on the 24/7 Sports Network. My name is Nathan King. Hope everybody is having a great 4th of July weekend, or whatever time of the month of July it is when you guys end up listening to this. We are continuing to roll through Auburn's 2022 schedule, and we are now in the heart of the schedule. We're playing rivals every single week. It's big matchups. It's teams that you guys know. As the Auburn's in the meat of the SEC schedule now, as we are on to week 6. Last episode, we had Matthew Brune from Go 24/7 gave a great preview of LSU and Brian Kelly heading into year 1 there. So be sure to go listen to that if you guys haven't. But today we have a special guest. Mr. Jordan Hill is joining us from Dogs 24/7. And if you guys recognize that name, that's because you probably read a lot of Jordan stuff when he was here. He's just recently, well, I mean, not too recent, but he was at the Opelika Auburn News for a long time as Auburn's beat reporter. And he's a Georgia guy back in his home state, covering the Bulldogs, and we're very happy that he is with the 24/7 Sports team. So, Jordan, first of all, how are you? I know it's been a while, but how are you enjoying the move to Athens?
Yeah, hey, Nathan King and Jordan Hill together again. They said that it, couldn't stop these two. Is what
The
they were
hater
saying.
said that it wasn't possible.
Would never happen.
Yeah,
Could never
here we
happen.
are.
No, it's been great. We moved to Athens. I guess that was early March. So at this point, it's almost been 4 months. Kind of hitting the ground running. But like you said, I'm from Georgia. Graduated from UGA. So it's been a pretty smooth transition. It's been tough. I really enjoyed, like you said, me being in Auburn before. Had a great time covering Auburn, getting a chance to meet all the people and be a part of that beat. But really excited about what this season's going to look like for Georgia, coming off obviously a national championship, no shortage of storylines, and I think it's going to be a really interesting year.
We will, of course, get to that first. I know that we go through all of these, and this is the first one where I really feel like I think half of the Auburn fan base probably is at a point where they're interested in every team. They obviously want to learn about what Auburn's 2022 opponents look like. Georgia is probably the first team we've gotten to here where you're about to sit here and talk very glowingly because they are the defending national champions, and some people will probably tune out because they hate Georgia. That's totally fine. We come to expect that from this and the Alabama episode, but I am really interested to hear about what the Bulldogs look like coming into 2022. But we'll start, of course, with last season. Jordan, I guess just it's been a few months, like you said. We watched the national championship game together in Auburn when you were obviously close to getting ready to go to Georgia. What has the reaction continued to be from them? Obviously, they broke a 40-year drought in terms of finally getting back on that national championship stage. It was really big in terms of getting over Alabama. I guess just when you look at all of those accomplishments for UGA, is it still buzzing in that direction? How much momentum, recruiting and every single facet, how much momentum did that give them? And I guess how much of a weight in terms of people you talk to around the program does that lift off their shoulders, particularly the Alabama thing, because that was a team they just couldn't get over. And it felt like they had to get over them if they were going to win a national championship. And that's exactly what they did on that stage.
Yeah, and I think honestly, the way it played out, from the Georgia perspective, I think it really needed to come against Alabama. I'd say if they had beaten a Clemson, Ohio State, people would still remember that they couldn't get over Alabama. Obviously, lost to Alabama in the SEC championship game. I think that mattered. I think from what we heard during the spring, talking to players, they were really honest about a lot of these guys too, especially the guys that grew up in Georgia. They hear about, the fact that they hadn't gotten over the hump. They'd heard, a lot of people, obviously still in this area, in the Southeast, just in general, are Alabama fans. They got to hear, from those people they grew up with and friends and family, about when y'all going to do it. When is it finally going to happen? And, I think for a lot of these guys, that was, a huge accomplishment. But at the same time, I think they understand that, they're basically starting over. That was something the very first day of spring that Kirby Smart really harped on. He was, anyone who's ever really listened to Kirby, he's never, really, warm and fuzzy with the media, I guess you could say. But, he said that was last year's team's accomplishment. Essentially, this is a brand new team. Obviously, a lot of guys from that team are gone now. 15 guys were drafted and have moved on. It's a new team and they've got new goals. I think that as much as they probably don't want to admit it, I think that they are upset they didn't finish the season undefeated, obviously having lost to Alabama and Atlanta. But I think this is a team that's hungry to prove that they aren't a one-hit wonder. They got close a few years ago. I guess that would have been the 2016 season or the 2017 season when they made it to the national title and lost in overtime. But I think this is a team that, especially with the players, understand that was a great accomplishment and those guys enjoyed it. But from everything we were told, it was basically once they got back to Athens, and especially after that parade in mid-January, basically a brand new slate and a goal to try to do something very similar in 2022.
Yeah, I was thinking about this when I was talking to Matt the last episode. The last 3 national champions have been from the SEC, but LSU sort of feels like the outlier. Not that you wouldn't call it a flash in the pan because LSU is a highly successful program, but you look at just how quickly it declined after that, and the fact that they're onto a new head coach just a couple years after. So for Georgia now, the focus is, I don't think anyone thinks that's going to happen, that they're just going to flash. Obviously, they've been on this stage for a while, but continuing to be in that national championship conversation with teams like you mentioned, Alabama, Ohio State, and Georgia kind of feel like your top teams right now. Looking at this team now, we were talking about before we started rolling. Very, very few transfers. Jermaine Burton was the big one that left. Obviously, he's expected to be a big impact player at Alabama. But as you noted, they didn't bring in any transfers from the portal. One part of that, of course, is when you've recruited as well as they have. But something you mentioned, they may not even have had room on this current roster.
Yeah, that's sort of, when you bring in, I think they signed like 30 guys in the 2022 signing class. A product of that is, we talk about how much things are changing with recruiting and things like that. Still, that scholarship number is still at 85. That still is the magic number essentially when it comes to scholarships. I mean, they're in a situation too where a guy last year, Dan Jackson, a walk-on who played a pretty good bit at safety. I kind of went into this offseason being like, it's going to be a no-brainer. They're going to put him on scholarship. Right now, I don't think they can just because of the numbers. But yeah, it was a situation where I think since the national title game, they've had probably 12 or 13 players who left. And most of those guys were reserve guys. And most of those guys weren't guys you expected to play. There were a few exceptions. Latavius Brini, I think he wound up at Arkansas. The big one, like you said, was Jermaine Burton. I mean, he was among their wide receivers, was their lead receiver last year. Brock Bowers, the tight end, was the guy who led in yards and touchdowns. But Jermaine made a lot of plays, and losing him, and not only losing him, but losing him in conference, I think can't be overstated. I think that's a huge loss. I think he's got an opportunity at Alabama to be a big playmaker, and losing a guy like that, it really puts a lot of pressure on Adonai Mitchell, a guy who made a huge catch in that national championship game. I mean, looked like something out of a video game to make one of those touchdowns in the fourth quarter. He's going to be counted on a great deal. I think he's looked at as the leading wide receiver. Now, you compare that with the fact that they have got an absolutely loaded tight end room. I mean, Eric Gilbert, along with Bowers, Darnell Washington, who, a lot of people haven't talked about Darnell, and he's like 6'6", 6'7", and has made plays, was a huge pickup from Nevada a few years ago when they signed him. And then they've got a 4-star and Oscar Delp at tight end. They have options at receiver. Losing Burton hurts, but they've got considerable talent still, and they got a lot of options at wide receiver besides Mitchell. One of the really intriguing things to me is just figuring out who is going to kind of lead the way in that receiving core, and what they're able to do with Stetson Bennett this fall.
Speaking of Bennett, there was obviously speculation as to what his decision was going to be after this season. Georgia gets him back. It's great to get yourself, obviously, a national championship quarterback returning on your roster. And I think I don't know about if squashed is the right word, but he definitely, gained even more confidence if fans didn't already have it in him with that national championship performance. I mean, I'm not sure Georgia wins that game with it. I mean, some incredible throws by him in that game. So maybe he has elevated himself from former walk-on game manager, you have a generational defense, to a guy that is the heart of your offense in terms of pushing the ball downfield in the passing game. Has that completely changed for UGA and the fan base? How much confidence is there in Stetson Bennett. And I guess what was the reaction when he decided to return?
I think that there is growing confidence with him having played the way he did. I can't help but think, had it been the other way, had Alabama won that game, even if Stetson played the way he did, there would have been questions. There would have been people saying he can't do it, which, I mean, as someone who grew up and like I'd mentioned before, went to Georgia, there were conversations, not quite to this level because Stetson was a walk on, but, guys like Aaron Murray got the knock of, well, he can't win the big game. That would have followed Stetson. And I think that the fact that he, not only that they played as well, he played as well as he did, they win the national championship. But I think this spring was big for Stetson. And it's something he talked about a great deal when we had a chance to talk to him. This time, last spring, spring of 2021, this was a guy that was getting third team reps during spring. And you think about how valuable, really getting to be that number one guy. This was his first spring where that was the way things played out. He was clearly the guy. Their backups played really well based on everything we heard and then even what we saw at G-Day. But Stetson was the guy. So this was the guy that was working with A.D. Mitchell. This was the guy that was working with Brock Bowers. It wasn't a situation where you get into the season 2 games in and your starter gets hurt and, okay, we got to get this guy in the game and he's going to have to figure this thing out on the fly. He talked about also feeling a lot more comfortable being a leader, talking to the receivers about, hey, let's run this route this way, really breaking down the mechanics of the route running and being on the same page. And that was something he really wasn't afforded last year. It was something that, they kind of had to, it's kind of trial by fire. And, it wasn't always pretty. There were games where he struggled. That SEC championship game against Alabama was not one of his better performances. But I think he's shown real strides. And I think that the way he went about spring, I think if you're a Georgia fan, would make you feel really good. And I think, too, he got plenty of praise. And I think that, there was never really the thought that he would not be the starting quarterback. But we heard a lot of good things about the other quarterbacks, Carson Beck, Brock Vandagriff as well. If there was a situation where he struggled, there could have been a competition, but I don't think it ever got to that level. And I think that's a credit to Stetson for looking at the opportunity and being able to seize it going into his super senior year.
What about the rest of this offense do you like this season? I know looking at their statistics from last year, the running game loses a lot of production, but you've got a guy in Kenny McIntosh that you probably still feel pretty good about. The offensive line is in a position where they probably feel like they're going to be pretty successful. And like you said, the tight end, I mean, those top 3 tight ends, Brock Bowers was one of the most exciting players in college football last season, which is really fun to say about a tight end. And then people forget about Eric Gilbert, but dude was one of the most sought after recruits in the country 2 years ago. And now he's obviously on his third SEC school. What do you expect out of this offense this coming season? I know they lose some guys at receiver, but you just talked about Bennett, another year under his belt. They're always going to have a lot of talent at running back, always going to have a lot of talent along the offensive line. Is there anything different you'd expect? Do you expect a step forward, a step back? What do you think you're going to see out of this offense as the season progresses?
I think they have a chance to maybe not so much take a step forward, but be kind of more of what gets attention about Georgia. Because obviously, even going back to when Kirby was hired, we all know that defensive-minded coach, defensive coordinator at Alabama, and year after year, obviously, with good reason, when you talk about Georgia, it's been the defense. And you're coming off of 2021 when that defense made an argument to be one of the greatest defenses, at least in the modern era of college football. I think this offense was really productive. If I'm remembering right, they were averaging something like 38 points a game last year, which obviously is no small feat. I think this offense has a chance to kind of showcase the skills. It's just a matter of in some of these positions, guys stepping up, like running back. You lose James Cook and you lose Zamir White. You need a guy like Kenny McIntosh, a guy that I've seen a lot of people looking at the 2023 draft thinking he has the potential to be one of the top running backs taken because he's such a good pass catcher. I don't think on any pass he was targeted last season, he had a drop. And they've really used those running backs to great effect, especially in the passing game with Stetson. I think it's a matter of guys like Kenny McIntosh and Kendall Milton, another running back too. Those guys stepping up. I think it's a situation too on the offensive line. they feel pretty good about what they have coming back. Really, the only question of the 5 spots is that right guard. Tate Ratledge, who would have been the starter last year, he gets hurt in the Clemson opener. Warren Erickson plays most of the season, and then in the championship game, he gets moved out. They kind of, pick and move some guys around to sort of settle that offensive line. Erickson's back. He's kind of competing for that spot. There's a few guys. Devin Willock's another guy. I think if they can get guys, like we said, some of those playmakers, at running back to step up, some of those receivers, along with A.D. Mitchell to kind of stand out. And if they get a clear starting right guard, whether it's Tate Ratledge coming back from that injury or one of these other guys that we got to see during the spring, I think this offense is in pretty good shape. And they locked up Todd Monken, the offensive coordinator, this offseason. They made him one of the highest paid assistants in the country. And I think that speaks to what they think this offense can be. And it's just a matter of if this can kind of sort itself out with the battles that are still going on, and if some of these guys can really rise to the occasion.
I believe when I looked at it, when I was looking at Auburn coordinators' salaries for this season, Monken is the top paid assistant in the SEC, right? Because of that bonus.
I think so.
Yeah, he's making $2 million.
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, and so like you said, it's all relative when you look at what Georgia's offense has been. Last season, like you said, generational defense, one of the best defenses of the modern era. Arguments will be made for years about them in 2011 Alabama as kind of defining the past couple decades. But Georgia had the number 9 scoring offense in the country. So, it was no slouch on that side of the ball, but you just look at, they were so dominantly number 1 on the opposite side that it sort of took a backseat. And then you talk about the SEC title game with Stetson Bennett, things like that. People, would turn their noses up at the offense occasionally, but they've got a big standard to fill this season because top 10 scoring offense. I know they were top 10 in a lot of efficiency categories, but it is that defense. And we'll talk now about Georgia's defense from last season. They obviously set a record for NFL draft picks, helped mostly in part because of that defense. And they, the number 1 overall pick was a guy on that defensive line. Obviously, Jordan Davis was a guy who got Jordan Davis, a name close to your heart. Yes. Got a lot of Heisman type buzz, sort of a Derek Brown at Auburn. You kind of compare those seasons there. But they've got Jalen Carter, who is getting similar hype along the defensive line. They've got lots of talent. We'll start with the front 7, and then we'll move to the secondary. Is it Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith, the big leaders there in terms of that front line and the second line at linebacker? And I guess, how are they, there's no chance you're going to reload in that same fashion and have the same, great defense that you had last year. But what are kind of their plans right now to be able to at least punch up and attempt to, have the number 1 defense in the SEC again?
Yeah, I think this is going to be a great case to really see. Obviously Georgia has routinely brought in some of the top signing classes these last few years. Now you really see, after a year like this, where you wind up having 15 total guys drafted, 8 starters from that defense are gone, how easily you can reload. Obviously, that's easier said than done, just generally. But yeah, it starts with Jalen Carter. This is a guy that I saw a mock draft this past week that had him as the 3rd overall pick. And even talking to him during the spring, Jordan Davis, I think, was the 13th pick. Devontae Wyatt was like the 27th or 28th overall pick in this draft. And these guys are telling Jalen, you need to work really hard because we think you can be better than us. And I think, that speaks volumes, not only of those 2 guys to say that to a teammate, but that backs up everything we've heard about Jalen Carter. I can remember, going to the start of that playoff run last year, the Athletics' Bruce Feldman really looked at Jalen and said, Jalen Carter is the guy that coaches are telling us, this is the guy we're really worried about. Obviously guys like Jordan Davis and Devontae Wyatt matter, but Jalen is just that kind of freak. And I think based on what we saw during the spring and the way he kind of, attacked, the work that was asked of him and the way he tried to take advantage, I think that he's in a really good position. I think he's going to be a defensive tackle that's going to cause a lot of havoc. And I think the thing that interests me, because really the 2 known commodities at this point between the front 7 is Jalen Carter and then Nolan Smith, who you mentioned before. Really good outside linebacker. I think when he came to Georgia, I think he might have been the number 1 overall recruit. He's been a really productive outside linebacker. He's a guy that some people thought might have gone pro last year. He talked about that, he was excited to come back to Georgia, and, he believes in what Kirby Smart is, selling and his message. But he said, Mom wants me to get a degree, so I'm coming back to Georgia for another year, get my degree, and have a chance to be really productive. I think he's got a big opportunity. And those two guys are sort of the guys we know that have played significant roles before. Obviously, a guy like Jalen is expected to do a little bit more since some of those guys have moved on. But the question is the guys stepping up around them. And we've gotten a little bit of sense of that, specifically inside linebacker. I mean, oh my God, Nakobe Dean, Channing Tindall, Quay Walker, I think they were all drafted in the top 3 rounds. You got to try to find people to step up in their place. And the guy that has really risen to the occasion, probably more so than anyone on either side of the ball, is Jamon Dumas Johnson, a guy they call Pop. And we said, why do you guys nickname him Pop? And it's because the way he hits at practice. He said, Nolan Smith told us he's always popping. You always know where he is on the field. This is a guy that obviously, with how deep they were at inside linebacker last year, he played sparingly, but when he got on the field, he made plays. That second game against UAB, he had a sack, he had a pick six. Once the game was pretty much decided and they had some of those reserves in the game, they need guys like Jamon Dumas Johnson to rise to the occasion to fill those holes. I mean, if you watched Nakobe Dean at all last year, I mean, it looked like you were playing a video game and you were looking over at what the opponent was going to call. I mean, he just had I think specifically there was a play against Kentucky where he read a pass out in the flats. I mean, it looked like someone had told him, specifically, it's coming right there. He just did that so routinely and made that such a habit that when you lose not only the production a guy like that brings, but just the football IQ, the ability to get his teammates where they're supposed to be. There was a really was kind of become a famous moment during that national title game where Nakobe got on to Channing Tindall because they had kind of had a miscommunication. It was in that second half, I think it was a point when Alabama was down on the goal line trying to score, and Nakobe got all over Channing for not being where he was supposed to be. But there was that understanding between each of them that, what Nakobe was telling his teammate was right. And then they kind of come back, and then the next play, there's a big sack that forces an Alabama field goal. You lose a player of Nakobe Dean's caliber, that's huge, but also just a teammate that these guys knew would get them in positions to succeed. I think that's a loss that is really, really tough to fill. They've got talent to do it. I'm just really intrigued by how smoothly that transition goes, even, really at the beginning of the year, what these guys who are asked to play bigger roles, what that looks like, how comfortable they are doing so, and just how smoothly it happens. Because for Georgia, they're starting the season against an Oregon team that, albeit, has a lot of changes, but this team won 10 games last year. This is not going to be a walk in the park where you just, mark that it's going to be a W, because if things aren't done smoothly and if there are issues specifically on that defensive side, it could be a really long day in Mercedes-Benz Stadium.
Yeah, you can't necessarily quantify the type of leadership and IQ that you can get with some of these players. I mean, the recruiting class, obviously, you hope that when you bring in top recruits like that year after year, that you're going to find a guy like that who's able to be a quarterback of the defense, and then be a true middle linebacker. So it'll be, like you said, it'll be interesting to see. And I know Jordan Davis was obviously vocal leader, big personality there on the defensive line. And we know from covering Auburn, when you have a guy like that, like a Derek Brown or Marlon Davidson on Auburn's side, usually leads to a lot of success when you can be disruptive up there and obviously have good communication with your linebackers. The secondary, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like maybe they, in terms of returning production, are in a bit of a better spot than everywhere else, just because of Keely Ringo, obviously could be the top cornerback taken in next year's draft, had that big pick 6 against Alabama. And then Chris Smith at safety is a big returner as well. Do they expect that maybe, I know they've recruited at defensive back, they've recruited obviously really, really well. Do they expect maybe they can take a step forward there, or what does that position group sort of look like in the defensive backfield?
Yeah, there's really a lot of promise, and I've seen, some of the outlets. I think Phil Steele has Georgia's defensive backs as the top in the nation, and a lot of that starts with Keely Ringo. Obviously, he ended the year with that 79-yard pick six that officially sealed the championship game. He's a guy that was a 5-star. That he last year was his first year playing after he had shoulder surgery his true freshman year. Yeah, and then you bring back another super senior in Christopher Smith, a guy that's got a lot of talent, and I think he was second on the team in interceptions last year to Darion Kendrick, who was a pretty big loss as far as corner, a guy they picked up from Clemson that's now with the Los Angeles Chargers. They feel pretty good about filling his spot. Everything we've seen during the spring and also just what we've heard. Kamari Lassiter is another guy that they have on the roster that has stepped up, kind of opposite Ringo. I'm really interested just to see what he does because I think a lot of teams, a lot of offensive coordinators understand what Keely Ringo can do. And I think that they're going to really try to work away from him. They're not going to give him opportunities to make plays like he made on Bryce Young in that national title game. The biggest question with the secondary is the second safety spot. They lost Lewis Seen, who wound up being the last pick in the first round, very talented safety. And it's sort of just a question of who's really in the mix for this job. I mentioned Dan Jackson, who again is a walk-on, but he stepped in for Chris Smith at the end of the regular season. I think he also played in that SEC championship game when Chris got banged up a little bit. He's kind of in the mix. He had some really good things to say during spring because now Will Muschamp is really working with him, working with the safeties. He acted like he's learned a lot, just in that spring alone from working with a guy with as much experience as Will Muschamp. And then you got a few other just sort of wild cards. Tacky Smith is a guy that was at West Virginia a couple of years ago and was an All-American from some outlets. He came to Georgia last year, was seen as a guy that could play right away. Got hurt very early in the year, kind of tried to play through it. I think really the only game he played significant time was against Auburn, and then he winds up tearing his ACL. So we didn't see him at all in the spring. He's still kind of working his way back. That's a guy that I think in a perfect world, he's 100% healthy and everything goes as it's supposed to. I think he's that other safety. But obviously, this isn't a perfect world. We don't really know how things are going or if he's had any setbacks or if some of these other guys, like a Dan Jackson, is a guy they trust, or some of these talented freshmen. They got a 5-star Malachi Starks that played and was the starting safety for the second team defense at G-Day at the spring game. So they've got options at that second safety spot. But to me, really, when you look at both the offense and the defense, it's right guard and it's that second safety spot to me that are the biggest questions where I say, they've got options, but it's not really clear who it's going to be. And it's going to be something to watch once we get into fall camp.
We'll look now at you mentioned Will Muschamp. They're kind of going, correct me if I'm wrong, a co-DC role right now to replace Dan Lanning. You mentioned the Oregon game. They opened with Oregon. It's pretty fun to be able to have an opportunity not only to go up against your former defensive coordinator, but the Bo Nix element of it is pretty fun as well to watch him take another shot at Georgia. Obviously, wasn't able to get a win over Georgia in his 3 years at Auburn. Before we finish off with your thoughts on Auburn, obviously we're a long way away, but I do want your thoughts on that matchup because you have a great perspective. You know this Auburn team pretty well. Let's look at the schedule overall for Georgia and what you think about their chances to make it back to the SEC title game, to make it back, obviously. And if you're in the SEC title game, you have a chance at the college football playoff. Just give me some of the highlights of this schedule. Obviously, if you're watching on YouTube or our live stream, you're seeing it right in front of you. We'll do our best job, the best job we can to describe it. It seems to me pretty favorable. That Oregon game is a little difficult, but you are catching Oregon with a first-year head coach. Everything else looks pretty nice for UGA to have an opportunity to go 12-0. But where do you see an opportunity for some snags, and what are the biggest games of the season for you?
I appreciate you pointing that out. It sets up really well because I feel like such a homer when I've started to work through these games and just
it looks great. It looks great.
I'm just like, man, it's just very hard. Obviously, when you go through a 12-game season, there can be slip ups.
Yeah.
But I think that this sets up really favorably for Georgia. Obviously, you don't get an Alabama out of the West. You've got Auburn, as always. And then you get Mississippi State, who I think could be a dangerous game. I kind of wrote a story on Friday and kind of pointed to that as the trap game, just because
Yeah, that looks like it to me. Yeah.
where it is coming toward the end of the season, the fact it's on the road, that's a game that really, really stands out to me. Other than that, I mean, there's a few games that I still think Georgia's in good shape with, but are just really intriguing. Sort of, kind of a setup as far as Georgia goes. Like Georgia at South Carolina, it's going to be noon in Columbia in mid-September. I was looking at what's projected. Obviously, this is a few months from now. It's supposed to be like 92. Like that early in the year, very first SEC game, a talented South Carolina team that pulled in a lot of, transfer portal additions. Like I still think Georgia wins that game, but you could see it just being an ugly, hot, kind of miserable game. Other than that, the other games that I've really kind of pinpointed as being crucial, if Georgia is at the very least going to win the East and at best have a chance at going undefeated in the regular season, is going to be that game in Jacksonville that's played every year against Florida. Anyone who has followed either one of these teams can tell you there are years where it's just, you go in and say there's no chance that Florida's going to win, or Georgia has no shot. And that's always the year where you go down to Jacksonville and some weird things happen, and some team gets a couple turnovers and all of a sudden the underdog wins. And it's so weird when you look. I think that game last year wound up being 34-7. I think we had it on in the Auburn press box.
We were laughing maniacally at, did Florida have 2 straight turnovers, 3 turnovers in 5 plays? Something to that effect. Yeah.
It was like a one possession game, and then all of a sudden it was like half the stadium has poured out because Nolan Smith has returned a pick, and I think Nakobe Dean might have had one. That's just one that, it's going to be very interesting. I don't really have a great feel for what Billy Napier Florida Gators are going to look like. I think that Billy Napier is a really talented coach. I was interested. The fact he stayed at UL Lafayette as long as he did, I think he waited for a really good job. But there's a lot of buzz about Anthony Richardson as a quarterback. A while ago, people started saying he had the potential to be a first-round pick. I don't know. He didn't play very well. I was looking at the stats when they played Georgia last year. He threw for like 82 yards and a couple picks. So, that one I just don't have a great feel for. And then the other one I wrote as sort of the team that I think is the most underrated, especially on Georgia's schedule, is Kentucky. Yeah. I just can't get over the consistency that Mark Stoops has been able to make out of a Kentucky team that was really, really bad when he took over about a decade ago. They've been really good. I think the fact that that's at the end of the season, who knows what kind of injury issues Georgia's dealing with at that point. The fact that it's at Kentucky, I think really, I haven't sat down and gone through all the games for all the teams. I think Kentucky has a chance again to be that second team in the East. I think
their schedule's pretty favorable. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think they have the talent. I think that, Will Levis is a really good quarterback. I think it is a pretty big blow that they lost Liam Cohen, a guy that I think was a really good offensive coordinator. He goes back to the NFL, to the Rams, but then they hired the 49ers quarterbacks coach. So I think they're kind of just trying to keep it clicking. I think Kentucky's kind of a dangerous team. And again, when you've gone through such a long season, who knows what kind of situation Georgia's roster's in at that point. But those are the games to me. And again, I'd mentioned that Mississippi State game. Those are the ones that really stand out to me as truly games where you go, I mean, I still think Georgia wins, but those could be really challenging games. And it could be a situation where, you're watching another game and you're seeing upset alert on the bottom of the screen. Because some of these teams, I think, especially where these games fall, could really put up a fight against Georgia.
I like the positioning of the bye week there before Florida. That game always reminds me of the Red River shootout, just because, like you said, you can kind of throw out the record. Truly, you can throw out the records. You can't say that about every rivalry. We've seen it with Texas in the last 10 years. Oklahoma's been much better, and Texas comes and almost wins that game every single time. Same thing for Florida and Georgia, except for last season, obviously, when it was a masterful defensive performance there. Yeah, I look at that last stretch of the season. not even counting Georgia Tech, because that program's going downhill very fast. And that game is in Sanford Stadium. You look at those last 4 SEC games, and there's only one true home game there, and it's against Tennessee. And Tennessee is a little prickly. I mean, they're going to put up a fight in this game. They host Alabama this season. A lot of people are looking at that one saying might be an opportunity for Alabama to slip up. But still, I mean, at Mississippi State, like you said, at Kentucky, all interesting, all going to be tricky. But at this point, it's one of those things where you're looking at the schedule as a whole, and you have to pick significant upsets to say that they're going to lose a game. And that's when you're in a great spot if you're Georgia. And when you're these other teams in the middle of the East, the middle of the West, bottom of the East, bottom of the West, you're not picking upsets. You're saying, yeah, Arkansas is better in that game. Yeah, I'd give Ole Miss a pretty good shot there. For Georgia, they're still top dog, literally and physically. So you'd have to say that, I think South Carolina is going to pull it off with Spencer Rattler. And so I think it does set up really well for them to be number one in the East. That Auburn game, as we're looking at it now, that falls on October 8th. It is back at UGA. Obviously, Georgia had no problem in that game last season. It was an explosive performance for Stetson Bennett, if I recall correctly. I know Ladd McConkey had a really long touchdown in that game. I think Stetson Bennett only had like 12 completions or something like that, but he still had 250, something like that. It was a 34-10 win. Really not much of a shot for Auburn because of that defense. Now they go to absolutely their worst house of horrors. You look at the streak that Auburn broke last year with LSU, was able to get over that hump. 2010 was the last time they won at Alabama. They've had a lot of issues there, but it goes back even further than that for UGA. I wanted to ask you about this game and this matchup, not to say, oh, well, what do you like about the matchups? And, is Georgia scared of this game? Kind of, what does this mean for Georgia's season? That's kind of the question we've been asking. The LSU, writer who came on, we talked about that with Penn State. What does it mean for the trajectory of the season? I don't really think that's valid here with Georgia, because for them, it's kind of just another lower tier opponent that comes into their house. I want to ask you, because you have great knowledge of this Auburn roster, what are some breaks in the armor that you think Auburn, even if you're having to go in an upset route, even if you're having to go out of left field a little bit, what are some areas where this Auburn team very well, saying, okay, if they do this, if they do X, Y, and Z, which I know they're capable of doing, they can keep this game close and go into the fourth quarter, whether it's Calzada at quarterback, whether it's Robbie Ashford. We know it'll be Tank Bigsby at running back. We know this defense is pretty solid, should be in the upper group in the SEC. What do you think Brian Harsin and the Tigers, when they go, again, to a place they've had very, very little success in recent memory, what do they have to do to keep this thing close, given what you know about this roster and what they look like heading into the season?
To me, what immediately comes to mind is that Auburn's defense has to have an Alabama or like the Iron Bowl 2021-esque kind of performance. I think that the key to Auburn having any kind of shot is to really rattle Stetson Bennett, whether that's bringing pressure, whether that's causing turnovers. I feel like that is the key for the defense to play really, really well. And then, on the other side, the thing that really just stands out to me, I just think that Auburn's going to have to find a way to get Tank some running room. I think that, again, Jalen Carter and Zion Logue's another guy that's probably going to be the nose tackle. I think those are talented guys. I feel like if you're put in a situation where, there's a lot of time last year when I'd look at some of, the box scores from Auburn and seen, Bo Nix throw 50, whatever, however many attempts he had, and just been like, man, that's just way too many. That just isn't going to work. I don't think you're going to want to be in a situation where if it's Zach Calzada or Robbie Ashford, whoever it is, that you're wanting to throw the ball all over the field, because, again, we talked about how good this Georgia secondary looks like it's going to be. I think if you're going to, really try to test a guy like Keely Ringo, you may not like what the result is. I think it's got to be a situation if we are looking at the game after the fact and saying, wow, either Auburn pulled the upset or Auburn kept it really close, sort of working our way back and kind of reverse engineering how they get there. I feel like it's just a big game from Tank Bigsby and probably also Jarquez Hunter. I think it's a situation where they figure out how to really test, which is still, I guess that's a little bit, probably a month into the season. Maybe you find some holes in this defense that's still trying to figure out some things. Maybe it's just a situation where, it's not come together as quickly as Georgia wanted it to. to me, that's what it boils down to. Is I feel like the defense just has to do a really good job, if not causing turnovers, then just really just thwarting what Georgia really wanted to do. And then I feel like it's got to be the run game. Just Tank really showing out again, kind of being back in his home state. Obviously, he grew up not far at all from Auburn, but getting a chance to show out and really try to break a streak that I don't know about you, Nate, that I was 11 years old the last time that Auburn won in Athens. It's going to be a tall task, and I'll be really interested just to see what the game plan kind of looks like on both sides as they try to come into Athens and pull up a big upset.
Yeah, if you look at what they've done against Alabama since their last win in Tuscaloosa, I think Alabama's averaging 45.6 points per game when they play there. Since Auburn's last win in Athens, in all their losses there, I think it's like 27.2 for UGA. So it's not necessarily, and you can cover in the team for a few years. When they go to Athens, yeah, they lose handily, but really it's like 24-6 or 21-7, something like that. I mean, Georgia hasn't, obviously they didn't play there last year, and Georgia came to Jordan-Hare and dropped 34 points in an explosive performance like we talked about. But in recent memory, this game has been lost because Auburn has been able to do absolute. I mean, I think 2 straight seasons they didn't have a touchdown there in Athens. And so there was that one year where they didn't convert a first down the entire second half. And so if you can solve issues like that, with this offense in year 2 for Brian Harsin, you should have, like you said, a good opportunity, and then keeping things close. Not a lot. It was the 2020 game there, which was the first one that was like mid-season. It looked like it was, I think, wasn't it 21-0, like beginning of second quarter?
I think so, because that was sort of Stetson's like, hey, I don't suck. I can play.
Right. Yeah. That was a big coming out party for him. That one looked like it was going to get way out of hand. And then I think that one ended up being 27-6. Something like that. Auburn kind of reeled it in and kept things close down the stretch. But you can't allow that to happen because this Auburn team, as it looks right now, doesn't have a lot of firepower, I think, in a road environment like that to be able to keep up. So I definitely wanted to get, I'm sure our listeners really appreciate that. Again, how many years were you on the Auburn beat?
So I was the primary guy on the beat for 2 years, but then I think there was 2 other seasons where I was, helping, doing sidebars. I went to all the home games in those years, but then there were 2 years where I was on the beat.
Yeah. So Jordan definitely knows what he's talking about when it comes to this Auburn team. In the last full football season you covered was at Auburn, and now heading into it's year 1 of the Jordan Hill era at UGA. And so we're obviously very excited for Jordan. We're excited to loop back around in the fall. That's obviously one of the biggest games of the season for Auburn. And so we're excited to get back with y'all and link back up with Dogs 247 to do some preview coverage there. So thank you so much to Jordan for hopping on today. If you guys enjoyed this show, please go leave us a 5-star review. That's the number one thing that helps us out. We would really appreciate if you guys do that. If you guys are listening to this before the end of the day on July 5th, we still have our 30% off promo going. And I always like to point out that 24/7 is great because if you're a subscriber to one site, you can go read message boards and VIP stuff anywhere. So if you're wondering what's going on, if any of that stuff that Jordan just talked about piqued your interest and you want to know a little bit more about some of those players, some of those position groups, or the trends that are happening, and you see a VIP piece over at their site that Jordan writes that's really interesting, you have access to it because you're a 24/7 subscriber. So be sure to go check that out, guys. You guys can try it out. First 2 months is only going to be $1. Give it a shot. If you like it, great. Sign on. If you don't, we won't kick you off the podcast. You can keep listening here because the podcasts are free. So thank you guys so much again for watching today. If you guys enjoyed it, please 5-star review. The intro and outro music is by Beats by Mordecai. You guys can follow him on Twitter, SoundCloud, and Instagram. And until the next episode, everybody have a great 4th of July weekend, and we will talk to y'all later.